Well, hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Randy Silva. My channel's name is The Withered Fig Tree, and I've been doing live streams about various Christian topics. The current series is called The Seven Spirits of Revelation. It's about the book of Revelation and the Spirit's role in it, among other things. And today is the final episode of that series. Unlike the other series that I've done that went 8 episodes, this one has gone almost twice that. This is episode 15. So let's go ahead and get started. So as you can see, the title of this episode is The End of the Apocalypse. I'll start with a review. This is the main slide from last week. So you had the introduction, the talk about the 7 churches, the throne room, and then these 3 different versions of God's redemptive plan. The first one having the most detail, the second having the next most detail, and the third having the least amount of detail. The first being the most, I don't want to say literal, but the most events that you can trace back to actual history, and then likewise going down less and less for the other 2. And then I talk about a timeless future and a conclusion. And this is where we will spend time in, and I kind of hope to, spend most of the episode in it. But there were a couple other things that came up that I think are just as important, but we definitely will finish with talking about chapters 20 through 22, the end of the book. One of those things that I want to talk about is the evidence for Revelation having an early authorship. So very early on, I think it was episode 1, talked about how Revelation could have been written, or John could have received the vision and then written it down and then had it disseminated. That could have happened in the 60s AD, so somewhere, let's say somewhere between 60 and 68 AD. That's before the temple's destruction, and that would be the early authorship. Or it could have been written later, and that would be 96 to 98 when John was on the Isle of Patmos at the very end of when he was there under Domitian, if that were the case. One of the things, and very early on, I didn't realize this was going to play such a big role, when Revelation was written. And so at that point, it seemed as though the evidence was favoring a later authorship towards the end of the 1st century. So an early writing date would be during Nero's reign. Nero reigned from 54 to 68 AD. He did exile certain leaders of movements to islands. It was a Roman way of doing things, so we know that Domitian did that as well, but that doesn't rule out the fact that Nero could have done it. And this early writing date works the best for preterist and this covenant view, this preterist type of view that I have been putting forth in this series. Now, in the book itself, it says what must soon happen at least 4 different times. There's a few other places where it says coming soon and things like that. But there's definitely lots of the book that is meant to happen soon. So it hasn't happened yet, relative to when it was written, but it would happen soon. And so that's why I put the book. If that was the case, if it was written in this early authorship, and the book is about things like the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, the siege of Jerusalem, those types of things that occurred in and around 70 AD, if this was written in the early to mid 60s, that would make the book contain near-term prophecies. But if it was written towards the end of the 1st century and it's about those things, then that doesn't make sense because the things that it says would happen soon would have already happened. That's why I think an early writing date makes much more sense. One of the things that when I was looking at the evidence for and against early and late writing periods was Revelation 3:17. It says, it's part of the letter to the church in Laodicea. It says, "You say, I am rich, I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Now, there was an earthquake in Laodicea in Nero's reign around 60 or 61 AD that leveled the city. When I was looking at different theologians' reasons for why it couldn't have an early writing date, it said this is one of the strongest reasons. If Jesus is talking directly to the churches and their state at the time, and it says that they are rich, but in fact, they're actually very poor because they may have been rich, but they just lost all their wealth in this earthquake, then that would be a problem. Now, what I found when I did a little bit more research is that Tacitus, the Roman historian, he explicitly says that Laodicea was unique in that it recovered by its own resources without Roman aid. And what that would mean is that the statement that we're rich, we need nothing, that type of vibe would actually fit well after the earthquake, because the famous detail is of their self-funded rebuild that Tacitus made note of. What that would mean then is that this quake doesn't force a late authorship date at the end of the first century. It actually could strengthen an early writing date, because it would say that Laodicea, they had this attitude that they are rich and they don't need any help. And even after the earthquake, they still had some of their wealth and they still had that kind of proud personality. And so that is what this verse that Jesus is talking about. Now, there were some other things in ante-Nicene writings. So those are writings from early Christian authors after the first century. And most famously was Irenaeus. So he was in the late second century. He's the most cited. And he says that the apocalypse, or the vision of John, was seen toward the end of Domitian's reign. And then there's also the second most noted person or referenced person is Eusebius, and that would be in the 3rd century. But he uses Irenaeus's statement. So really the main thing is it's Irenaeus. Irenaeus in the late 2nd century said that the apocalypse, which was what the book was originally called, the Apocalypse, was seen toward the end of Domitian's reign. What I think about this is that it's this idea it was seen. Irenaeus is writing 100 years or so after 70 AD. As far as he knows in terms of the history that was handed down to him, was that this book that John had written from a vision that he had, that it was seen towards the end of the 1st century. But that wouldn't mean that it was written and disseminated at the end of the 1st century. It could have been written and disseminated earlier than that, but it just didn't take root. It wasn't read by all of the Christian churches. It didn't have a full proliferation. For whatever it was, people didn't start talking about it in a way that history would remember it until towards the end of the 1st century. One of the things that Revelation does is it has some internal dating to it. So partly we talked about it already in the 7 churches. But there's also a verse in chapter 17 talking about the kings or the emperors who would rule Rome. One was, one is, and one is yet to come. Or that could be used to date when it was written, when the vision was received. And that one who is, if we could figure out which king that is, then we would know present tense, that is when the book of Revelation was written. That's what got me starting to look at the 10 horns and 7 heads of Daniel and Revelation. So we see the 10 horns mentioned in Daniel, and we see 10 horns and 7 heads mentioned several times in the book of Revelation. And so here's where you see it. Daniel 7, 7 through 8, and 20 through 25, and Revelation 12, 3, Revelation 13, 1 through 3, and Revelation 17, 3 through 16. What I found is that there are many ways to count kings and heads of Rome. I did find that there's a lot of theologians behind this idea that the first emperor of Rome was Augustus. We'll see some lists here in a second in the other slides. So that was one thing that I had to contend with. One way of looking at both Daniel and Revelation is that the number 10 and the number 7 are both symbolic, and 10 horns, therefore, would be totally symbolic. And if that was the case, then the 10 horns could be interpreted as a human complete leadership, or a complete set of leadership of humans, because the number 10 had to do with human completeness. And then the number 7 with the number of heads, that could refer to its divine inspiration behind the leaders to use Rome to destroy Jerusalem, the temple, and the Old Covenant with it. You could also see it as part symbolism and part literal. So you could say something like the 10 horns are symbolic, but the little horn, it's part of Revelation. Actually, no, that's in Daniel, sorry. So the little horn, which is part of Daniel, is, and things like when it says one is, those things are literal. So the little horn could occur in any order, really, because the 10 before him aren't 10 literal kings. It's just referring to this complete period of human leadership, followed by this little horn, which then becomes literal. You actually would place, you'd say such and such is the little horn. And then if the 7 heads were symbolic, it does say that the beast is an 8th king in the same grouping as the 7. And so in that case, you could see the 7 heads as symbolic, but the beast as a literal emperor. Or probably what happens more often than not, which is usually not the case, or I guess you'd say you're kind of on thin ice with the book of Revelation, is to view it all literally. And I would say you would never do that. But I guess what I'm saying is you could see him as symbolic and literal. That not only did the 10 horns represent human complete leadership, but they also happen to represent 10 actual leaders or kings. And that 7 does mean that it is a divine inspiration behind that empire and those leaders, but that they also happen to be 7 real leaders of Rome. And the little horn is real as is one is, this is a quote now from the book, one is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for a little while. So when you read that type of a verse from Revelation 17, that sounds very specific, and it sounds like the vision is pointing to a particular, I would say that as well. It sounds like he's talking about a particular leader of Rome. Some treat the book of Daniel's chapter 7, where he talks about the beast that has 10 heads, separate from Revelation, basically meaning not referring to the same king. Here's what Daniel 7:7-8 says. The 4th terrifying and frightening, very powerful beast with large iron teeth. Now I'm paraphrasing here, I'm just taking it out. But it says that the 4th beast was terrifying and frightening. It was very powerful, and it had large iron teeth. And it crushed and defeated its victims. And it says it was it behaved differently from the other beasts in that how vicious it was. It starts with 10 horns. And then it says that a little horn, which is, it definitely is very clear to say that it's a separate horn, appears and uproots 3 of the 10 horns. It also says that little horn has eyes like a human and a mouth that speaks boldly. So that's all very interesting. And this first part is when Daniel is receiving the vision. The second part is when an angel comes along and interprets the vision for him. So this is in Daniel chapter 7, verses 20-25. So paraphrasing it, I put that Daniel wants to know about the 10 horns and the little horn with eyes and a boastful mouth that uproots the 3. He also adds a little bit of information here. He says that the little horn looked more imposing than the others. So it's interesting that it was a little horn, but however it was in terms of size, it still was more imposing than the others. And also he adds something he didn't mention in this earlier part, that the horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them. So then the angel gives an explanation. He says the 4th beast is a 4th earthly kingdom that will be different from all other kingdoms in that it will devour the whole earth. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise. Different from the earlier ones, he will subdue 3 kings. He says he will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and a half a time. There's that 3.5 reference. Revelation says, in regards to things with horns and heads. So Revelation 12:3, it describes the red dragon as enormous, and it says it has 7 heads and 10 horns, and it says that 7 crowns on its heads. So I don't know if that's 7 crowns on each head, or some of the horns had crowns and 3 of them didn't. Okay, so then Revelation 13:1-3, this talks about the beast out of the sea. It says it has 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on its horns, each with a blasphemous name on it. The beast resembles a leopard, has the feet of a bear, and a mouth like a lion. And in verse 3 it says, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. So that's a very interesting little tidbit that makes it sound literal. Okay, Revelation 17:3-16, verse 3, it says there's a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that's covered with blasphemous names, and it has 7 heads and 10 horns. Verse 7 says the angel will explain the mystery of the woman and the 7-headed, 10-horned beast. Verse 8 says the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. And I think this is one possible way of rewriting this. The beast once was in the abyss, now is not in the abyss, and will come up out of the abyss again. That's the only verse that says, it's not the only verse that says once was, now is not, and yet will come. In fact, it's actually used again in this verse. But it's the only one that relates it to the beast and its location relative to the abyss. Verse 9 says the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now, Rome is well known to be a city with 7 hills. Jerusalem is not. In fact, I found that the city on 7 hills, that trope, started with Rome. And some people may have tried to assign it to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem, especially back in this period of time, was considered to have 2 hills with a valley, and sometimes it was called 4 mounts, but never 7 hills. Verse 10 says there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. So it's talking about the heads. So the heads are also, not only are they representative of 7 hills, which is Rome, it's also representative of 7 kings, 5 of whom have already fallen. So they've already died. They're not in leadership anymore. 1 is in leadership. The other has not yet come, but when he does, he must remain for only a little while. And a little while is subjective, but it's typically interpreted as that the person's not in power as long as the rest of the emperors. The other emperors, reign for, let's say, on the average 10 years. So this one would be probably shorter than 5 years. That kind of level of specificity and information would make it seem like this is a real person, real 7 kings that we're talking about. Verse 11 says the beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. So that's very different from the other references to beasts with horns and heads. This one actually names the beast as a king, not the beast as an empire, and the horns and heads as leaders within that empire. In Revelation 17, its description says the beast is actually one of the kings as well. It's an 8th king. It says it belongs to the 7. This is a continuation of talking about Revelation 17:3-16. So verses 12-14, it says, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb. I put that this does not sound like Roman emperors, because they have received a kingdom, and they didn't rule for a very short period of time. even I think 1 hour is symbolic, but I think it's symbolic meaning a short period of time. So what I think this sounds like is they're referring to generals or provincial leaders or governors who helped the beast destroy Jerusalem and the temple and persecute Christians. And that would mean that the 10 horns are not leaders of Rome, not like full leaders or emperors of Rome. And this is reinforced by the fact that the beast itself is an 8th king who belongs to the 7. So it's using the number 10 or the 10 horns in a different way than Daniel, in a different way than the other references in Revelation 12 and 13. This statement is helpful because if it's true that these 10 horns, we don't have to kind of worry about them anymore, that would simplify things, and we can just focus on the 7 heads, which it says are 7 kings, and we could focus on the beast, which it says is an 8th king. And you can recall that it talks about 5 who have fallen when it was describing the 7 heads. 5 have fallen, 1 is, another is yet to come. When he does, he must remain for only a short little while. And then you would see the beast, the 8th king, come after that. Here's a list of emperors of Rome. Take your pick. And the reason why I said that is because there's a lot of different ways to number the kings of Rome. And you have to think about this apocalyptic style of writing, and especially in Daniel. Daniel is writing well before, these kings ever existed. And so here's a list. And the first thing that's going to stick out is that I'm not numbering these at all. I'm just giving information here. Sulla, he was a ruler. Let me start with this. Rome did not become an empire until either what some people will say the end of Julius's reign or the beginning of Augustus. And a lot of people actually would say that Rome did not become an empire until Augustus. And I would agree with that. That's totally true. Would the Bible in its writings and its prophecies, would God use that definition then for king? Only those leaders who occurred after Rome was no longer a republic, but was a dictatorial empire. And I don't think he would. I think for instance, if God was writing some sort of prophecy about today, he would talk about the kings or the horns would be, if he was talking about America, would be presidents, for instance. But presidents don't have full power. They share the power with Congress and the judiciary, regardless of what you think. And, they're definitely not an emperor, and they're not a king either. They still would be the person who would be in a prophecy written, let's say, hundreds of years before. They would be the horns. If they said, there are going to be 47 horns, that would be referring to 47 different presidents. So, I don't see any reason why God looking into the future, let's say back in the time of Daniel, in the 6th century BC, would say, I'm not going to count these people because they weren't during the time of the empire. No, Rome was Rome. Rome was this country that ruled the world before it was an empire. Now, I do think that the God in the past would look at, or I don't know how to say that in a better way, but that in Daniel in it's in the 6th century BC, would look forward and count rulers who were actual rulers. And that's a little bit harder to come by, but that's where you get these other two people. So Rome was a republic led by its Senate, except for early on in the 80s, from 82 to 80 BC, this guy Sulla came in and basically kind of took over the Senate, and he was considered a dictator. And then the Senate got its power back after he died, or I think he was killed. And then Julius, he was the next person. He started out as just a regular leader under the control, I guess you'd say, or the power of the Senate. But then the Senate gave him dictatorial powers. First, they gave him a 10-year term, and then that was in 47 BC. And then in 42 BC, they made him dictator for life. Now, and then he was killed. So that was it. But he was definitely a dictator. So depending on how you're counting, Sulla and Julius could be on that list. These guys are definitely on the list. Well, I should say most of these guys are definitely on the list. Remember, you had the year of 4 leaders that was in 69 AD, not in a single year, but a year, 12-month period. You had Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. And so these 3 guys were so short, and there was such a tumultuous time after Nero committed suicide that the empire almost fell apart, and there was a civil war. And you could see how symbolically these 3 guys could be representative of just one. Or you could see how a prophecy could just remove all 3 of them together, because they really didn't have power over the empire long enough to really do anything. So again, it is kind of how you view these prophecies. And the prophecies are in nature enigmatic. And so you could see, like if you were in heaven and you were asking, the angel, hey, could you finally explain Revelation to me? They might say, or he might say, oh yeah, we just considered Galba, Otho, and Vitellius one king because they were just one after another. Or he might say, oh, we didn't consider them at all because they didn't really rule. Or of Sulla, they would say, oh no, we didn't start with Sulla. We started with Julius. And, you might argue back, well, everybody said it was Augustus. I don't know. Augustus was the first emperor, but, Julius was a leader and he was a dictator. I don't know what the angel would say. It would be nice if we could get him on the phone, right? So here are the list of these people who were emperors or dictators of Rome. And here are a bunch of different lists that you can come up with. So this first list starts with Sulla and just goes through this list, and I just stopped at 11 at Vespasian. And I did consider Galba, Otho, and Vitellius independent leaders. So that's one way of doing it. Here's another way of doing it. You start with Julius. You don't consider Sulla because he took over, and it was actually meant to be a Senate. And so when he took over, it really wasn't, we shouldn't count that. So, but Julius was, you could say, he was a dictator. So we're going to start with Julius. So then you could have those 10. You could start with Augustus. This is the standard list, I would say, number 3. You start with Augustus, the first emperor for sure, and no questions there. And Galba, Otho, and Vitellius separate. You could have number 4, for instance. This starts with Sulla, but then it combines those 3 guys into one. Number 5. This one starts with Julius, but combines those 3 guys into one. Number 6 starts with Augustus, but it combines those 3 guys into one. Number 7 starts with Sulla, but just gets rid of all 3 of these guys. Those guys, it just goes from Nero to Vespasian, just jumps right over it. And then number 8 starts with Julius. And you could also start with Augustus and get rid of those guys. So there's a bunch of different ways of numbering this. And I would say that all of these would qualify from an enigmatic, historic prophecies standpoint. You might say, well, which ones require the least amount of spiritual or interpretive gymnastics or something like that? And you could make arguments for each of these, but nevertheless, there's other ways, I'm sure, of doing it. I came up with these 8. So I put here that I think Daniel is referring to Rome. So that's, for me at least, it's a no-brainer. And I think the iron teeth is a dead giveaway because he also refers to the 4 different parts of the statue in Daniel chapter 2 in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And in that case, the iron legs and the iron feet mixed with clay, it's talking about Rome, I think. So let's just go with that one. Daniel's talking about Rome. Now, I think the detail in Daniel's vision and the angel's interpretation, they point to real kings because it says that. So we can say that they're symbolic, number 10, but that they're also literal. That Daniel and the vision he was given were actually talking about 10 real kings, and actually 11th one, because there's another one, a little one, that shows up and subdues 3. Now, Revelation, on the other hand, it definitely reuses apocalyptic symbolism. It also reuses references to that Daniel made, but it's also clearly talking about Rome, at least in its near horizon. And I guess I would say I don't think there is a far horizon in the book of Revelation. I probably wanted to talk, spend more time talking about that. But after all that I've gone through reading and researching this, I don't see it. I don't see a far horizon for the book of Revelation. So the near horizon is it, in my viewpoint. And that one is apocalyptic symbolism, and it's definitely referring to Rome. This means that the beasts are or can be different aspects of Rome. They don't have to align directly with Daniel, and I don't think they all do. So if you look at list number 1, that's this one that starts with Sulla, and it makes Vespasian the 11th. That one works with Daniel 7 without any sort of gymnastics. It makes Vespasian the 11th little horn who subdues 3 horns. I put Gov because I didn't want to write out Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. So that's Gov. If you put those 3 letters together. So, and that makes a lot of sense, because who does he subdue? He subdues these 3 guys and brings literally he only killed Vitellius. I think Otho committed suicide and Galba was killed. But you could see symbolically that these 3 guys, under whom the empire was in a civil war, that Vespasian subdues these 3 guys that led for less than a year. And that's why the angel and the vision back in Daniel 7 in the 6th century, that would make tons of sense. But you also have to remember that the angel says this thing about the 11th horn, the little horn, that would try to change the set times and the laws. Now, if you look at historically, Antiochus IV would be a really good fit for that. And, maybe Daniel had a near horizon of the Greek Empire after Alexander, and also had a slightly further horizon of Rome and the destruction of the temple, but it at least talked about Rome. And so I guess what I'm saying is I'm not looking for a Greek ruler like Antiochus IV. It's the wrong empire. So I looked for Domitian. So he came after Vespasian. He was Vespasian's son. He tried to change laws and the calendar and things like that. And he was also someone who tried to act as someone who was he wanted to be considered a deity. And so he was a bad guy. And I guess you'd say Vespasian didn't raise him very well. Or maybe he did. Maybe Vespasian would disagree. But Domitian could fit. Now, could Vespasian fit? Probably is what I would say. You'd have to look at history and find out how Vespasian tried to change times, and that could refer to, and laws, that could refer to the Roman time scale, or it could refer to the Jews as well. So it could be the times. Maybe he tried to attack earlier than God wanted him to, and so God had to set him straight. Maybe he tried to change some of the Jewish laws or something like that. I guess what I'm saying is that I think the list number 1 works the best for Daniel 7, and that this little disagreement here with did Vespasian change set times and laws, I think he probably did in some way. List 2 all the way to 8 work with Revelation 13, 1 through 3. It says, the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. Now, the reason why all these lists work from 2 all the way to 8 is because if you're just looking strictly at, is there Nero and Vespasian on the list? That's all the lists. They all have Nero and Vespasian. And the idea is that Nero committed suicide and the Rome itself was wounded and it was healed when Vespasian finally got the empire back under control. And that's why I put Nero would be the one with the near fatal wound and Vespasian would be the healed one. 2 and 5 work with Revelation 17:10. That says, that would be that, that's the one that says that there were 5 who had fallen, 1 who is, and 1 who will be, but that 1 who will be will only reign for a little time. So that has to be a list where Nero is the one who is, and Galba, or you can also consider all 3 of them as serving for a little while. And so that's why you have 2 and 5. So 2 is this one and 5 is this one. So this combines all 3 of them into 1. In these 2, you see that you have these 5, Julius through Claudius. That would make Nero the one who is, and then these guys, or just one of them, the one who would reign for just a short period of time. And then it would make the beast that the woman was sitting on Vespasian. And then I put number 7 works for Revelation 17:11. The beast who once was, now is not, and an eighth king who belongs to the 7, with Vespasian being the beast. But that doesn't work because the ruler after him would have to rule for just a little while. So that doesn't work. You could try to force it in there, because Vespasian originally started attacking Jerusalem as a general, and then there was a civil war, so that's why he had to go back to Rome, get things under control, and then he returned as an emperor insofar as he commanded Titus to go and take things over. So what does that mean in terms of which is the best? Well, I think this idea that Nero was the one who is works the best for me in terms of the writing period, because that would be between 54 and 68 AD. Anything before him would be too early for Revelation, and anything after him, especially when you get to these, would be too late because the temple would already have been destroyed. So Nero really is the one under whom Revelation was written. That's the only one that makes sense to make the verses that talk about things happening, being fulfilled in a short period of time, or near, or soon, that is a prophetic thing. It's prophetic because it was written before it happened. It was written before 70 AD. And so it could be written anywhere in this period of time, but it does seem like the early 60s would be the best time, the one that fits the best. Vespasian also then ends up being the one who represents the beast the best, insofar as he is the one who either started destroying Jerusalem or commanded Titus, his general, to destroy Jerusalem. If we go with all that, then that would mean that Nero is the one who is, and Galba would be the one or all 3 of these would be the one who's next, who only reigned for a short period of time, and then came the next leader, which was the beast. And so these 2 would work for that. This one wouldn't work because you don't have 5. I guess you'd say this one doesn't work because you have more than 5 before Nero, and there's supposed to be 5 that fell. So number 2, number 2 works the best, I guess is what you'd say, for Revelation. Number 1 works the best for Daniel. Okay, let's talk about Revelation chapter 20. So the first part of Revelation 20, I think, is the most interesting, is a very interesting part. It's the 1,000 years. It's also where a lot of other views, especially the futurist view, that are the most mystical. Let's look. It says, verse 1, and I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, the devil, who is the devil, or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations any more until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. Okay, so that's just a small part of Revelation 20. The next part talks about how those who had not worshipped the beast or had its image or had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. Then it talks about how the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. Then it says, this is the first resurrection. This is verse 6. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. 1,000 years, is that literal? Well, everything in Revelation is symbolic. So it's a symbol. But is it a symbol and literal? So that's really the way to put the question. I started here, I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but starting with chapter 20, it introduces 3 features that feel very future-oriented, not just near-term, but longer periods of time. So a long-bounded period of 1,000 years that Satan is restrained from deceiving the nations, and after that he's released after that long period, but just for a short period of time. And then you also don't see anything in these 3 chapters that you could relate as easily, or it just doesn't have the verses to try to describe symbolically or literally Jerusalem being sacked or the temple being destroyed, like you see in the 3 recapitulations of the earlier chapters 5 through 19, where those 3 recapitulations exist. So you have to start with the number 1,000 being symbolic. Now the number of 10 is the apocalyptic symbol for human completeness. And to get to 1,000, you have to multiply it by itself, 10 times 10 times 10 to get to 1,000. So now you have the number 3. So, or 10 to the third is another way of thinking it. And that would indicate a fully complete but divinely bounded human period. There is one event, let's say it was literal. So it's 1,000 years symbolic as well as 1,000 years literal. There is one event that's about 1,000 years after 70 AD, not quite. That's the Great Schism of 1054. I'm not sure how many theologians, if any, think that this is what it's referring to. I don't think so. It doesn't make sense. It's not exactly 1,000 years, and it doesn't seem to be. What you'd have to see is that after this time, after the 1,000-year symbolic period, and Satan is released for a short period of time, during that time, you would have to see Satan working at the nation level of deception. Humans are great. That's why this third point here, or this last point, humans are evil enough without Satan to make it difficult to detect when he's been released. So it's like, well, when was he released? Somebody said, oh, he was released 10 years ago. Oh, okay. Yeah, so then all that time in between from 30 AD to, a few years ago, that was just human evilness on its own, which is definitely, a possibility. Okay, so here's one that I put, 2030, the year 2030. So that would be exactly 2,000 years after Christ's death, assuming that Christ was killed in 30 AD. Some people say it was 33 AD, so I guess you could say 2033. Not that God has to work on even 2,000-year boundaries. God can do whatever he wants. But you could also kind of see God doing that. It's not 1,000 years, but it's 2,000 years. It's a nice short period of time. That's kind of how I see it. But then I also found that there is a well-known Jewish rabbinic belief that God works in 2,000-year cycles. So if you look at it that way, then you could see that Abraham was roughly chosen 2,000 years before Christ, and then you'd have 2,000 years later Christ, and then 2,000 years after Christ's death, you would have something. You could have the end of the world, or you could have Satan released from the abyss. One thing I said here is I could see someone arguing that the New World Order or the WEF or AI or alien disclosure, those big things, those could be a signal. Some people, if you look at the advent of atomic weapons or thermonuclear weapons, certainly World War III, people would say, if there's thermonuclear weapons being exploded and people destroying everybody, then you could say, oh yeah, that sounds like Satan has been released for a short period of time, just enough to rile up certain humans to press the button, as it were. After that, in chapter 20, is the judgment of Satan. This is when 1,000 years are older. Satan will be released from prison. He will go out and deceive the nations to the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. This does sound like after this symbolic 1,000 years are over, Satan and these Gog and Magog are referring back to Ezekiel 38 and 39. But the four corners, remember, that's the whole earth. The number 4 is the cosmic number. Here it sounds like Satan's going to be released after a certain amount of time. Things are going to be bad, not like hunky-dory before that, just because of regular human evil. But now with Satan in there, he will organize humans and their leaders to have a huge war. You could see how some people would say World War I was this. I know the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that. You could say World War II was that. It was even more worldwide and bigger war than World War I. And then you would assume World War III would be the same type of thing. And why World War III versus another one? Well, probably assume that World War III would end the earth. World War II and I did not end the earth. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet is, I guess you'd say, the unsaved of Jerusalem. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So then you see the judgment of the dead. And this is where it talks about this book. So the dead were judged according to what they were done, as recorded in the books. And the sea, which is like the sea of humanity, gave up their dead and all that in it, all the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. And then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. And the lake of fire, it says, is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Now, that's where some Christians, there's basically two Christian camps, if you will, of what eternity will be after the earth is destroyed. Some say that those who weren't in the book of life will simply be destroyed. They'll be disintegrated in the lake of fire. Others say that they will continue to live in hell and be tormented forever. I could see that supporting this idea that those who disobeyed or were not in the book of life just end. Chapter 21 through 22, you see the new heaven and the new earth. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." That's awesome, but you can also see how it's very symbolic. Some people would also argue that God already dwells with us, inside of us, but it is a very limited relationship, I guess you'd say. It's a spirit within people, so maybe this is more direct, that God is actually just like in the garden, like walking around amongst the people. I said some people try to put a definite date on this, even on chapter 20. I think that a timeless or just a constant, a progressive or occurring works the best, meaning that from when the destruction of the temple, that now the new covenant reigns as the only covenant, and during that time, if you die, then you go to heaven. If you die and you weren't in the book of life, then you would go to hell and possibly be destroyed at some other later point. Once Satan is finally removed, John leaves this covenant historical language entirely and moves into what the apocalyptic writers call creation restoration language. All this newness and no bad things. New heaven, new earth, no temple, no death, no curse. God is dwelling directly with humanity, and you can see that this is no longer just about Israel. Israel is just another country in there, or about Rome. Rome is just another country, and it's outside of this covenant transition. And I talked about how these last two chapters are ontological, having to do with the state of being, that this is how things were meant to be and how things will be, that God will set things right, and that those people who are wicked will be gone, and those people who are in the book of life will exist with God without death, without a need for a temple, and no curses, no tears. That is how God intended things to be. I hope you enjoyed this series. I know I had a comment from when I first started the series that he asked if I realized how much I was biting off of when I said that I was going to cover the book of Revelation. They were right. It was a big thing to bite off, but I feel a lot... I think I definitely learned a lot. First of all, I learned a lot about the book of Revelation that I had avoided for a long time. But I also think I took some points away. And one of the main points, I would say, is that the Holy Spirit is in the book of Revelation. And the Holy Spirit, he is the seven spirits of God, or the seven angels of God. And you see the Spirit that being the one who works on earth after the death and resurrection of the Lamb. And so that has a lot to do with the era of the Spirit. So for my next series, but it's going to be about the history of the Jewish people after the temple, maybe some before the temple, and going forward after the temple up into modern times. It's not going to be a political thing or anything like that, but it is going to be a theological study of how the Jewish religion has evolved. So thanks again for joining me for this series, and have a great evening.